There is another piece of information that can be derived from criticism, one that usually requires a great deal of soul searching. It is possible that the woman's criticism of her partner is a valid statement about herself. In other words, all the while she is berating her mate for his lack of organization, she may be as disorganized as he is. To find out if this is true, she could ask herself a general question. In what way is my criticism of my partner also true of me? She should keep in mind that the way in which she is disorganized may be quite different from her partner's MO. She may keep an immaculate kitchen, for example, and be a whiz at planning vacations, the areas where he has difficulties, but have a hard time prioritizing her tasks at work or managing the family budget. With this new insight, she would be able to determine whether or not she was attempting to disown a negative part of herself by externalizing it, projecting it onto her partner, and then criticizing him for it. If she found that to be true, she would have the information she needs to allow herself to separate her own negative traits from her partner's. I am disorganized in this specific way. My partner is disorganized in that specific way. In psychological terms, she would be owning and withdrawing her projections. Jesus said it more poetically. Cast out the log in your own eye, so that you can see the mote in your brother's eye. This leads us to a third observation about criticism. Principle 3. Some of your repetitive emotional criticisms of your partner may be an accurate description of a disowned part of yourself. Often, when a recurring criticism is not a description of a disowned part of the self, it is a description of another unconscious aspect, the lost self. If this woman were to scrutinize her behavior and find herself to be supremely well organized in all aspects of her life, her criticism of her husband might be an unconscious wish to be less organized, to be more relaxed, flexible, and spontaneous. When she criticizes her husband for behaving in a carefree manner, she may be secretly resenting his freedom. When partners criticize each other for being too energetic, too sexy, too playful, too dedicated to their work, they are often identifying undeveloped or repressed areas of their own psyches. Now we have our fourth and final principle. Principle 4. Some of your criticisms of your partner may help you identify your own lost self. In the next chapter, in an exercise called the Behavior Change Request Dialogue, I will show you how to take the knowledge that you can glean from your mutual criticisms and convert it into an effective, growth-producing process. Understanding your partner's inner world. As we have seen, examining your criticisms of your partner turns out to be an excellent way to gather information about yourself. How can you increase your knowledge of your partner's inner world? The answer is through improved channels of communication. Throughout the course of your relationship, your partner has given you thousands of hours of testimony about his or her thoughts and feelings and wishes. But you have in turn registered only a fraction of this information. In order to deepen your understanding of your partner's subjective reality, you need to train yourself to listen and communicate more effectively. To do this, it helps to know something about semantics, the science of describing what words mean. Even though you and your partner speak the same language, each of you dwells in an idiosyncratic world of private meanings. Growing up in different families with different life experiences has given you separate lexicons. As a trivial example, let's explore what the simple words "let's play tennis" might mean in two different families. In family A, The full, unspoken definition of this phrase is, let's grab any old racket that happens to be lying around, walk to the local park, and lob the ball back and forth across the net until someone wants to quit. Rules are secondary. It's the exercise that counts. In Family B, however, let's play tennis has quite a different meaning. It means, let's reserve an indoor court at a private club, get out our $200 rackets, and then play tough, competitive tennis until one player is clearly the winner. Mark, raised in Family A, is going to be taken aback by the aggressiveness and determination that his wife Susan, raised in Family B, brings to the game. A less trivial example would be the associations that Mark and Susan might bring to the phrase, let's talk about it. Assume that in Susan's family, let's talk about it means all the adults sit around the table and calmly and rationally discuss their various points of view until they come up with an agreed-upon plan of action. In Mark's family, the same words mean, this is a topic that we will talk about briefly and then shelve until further notice. Underlying Mark's family's more casual approach is the philosophy that even the most difficult problems work themselves out over time. When Susan proposes to Mark that they talk about the fact that their son is getting poor marks at school, and Mark says a few sentences and then switches on the TV, she feels irate. Mark, in turn, is going to be stunned when Susan storms out the door and does not return for several hours. What did he do wrong? What he did wrong was assume that he and his wife shared the same unspoken language. Denial. Besides the problem of idiosyncratic language, there are other roadblocks to communication. Perhaps the most common mechanism is denial. You simply refuse to believe what your partner has to say. A recent example comes to mind. Joseph and Amira came to one of my weekend workshops. Joseph is a 40-year-old journalist. Amira, a 25-year-old television actress. They are both attractive, accomplished people. On Saturday evening, about midway through the seminar, the key source of their conflict began to emerge. During a discussion period, Joseph volunteered that he desperately wanted to start a family. I'm going to be old enough to be a grandfather before I'm a father, he lamented. But Amira wanted to wait. Her career was just getting off the ground, and she didn't want to take time off to have a baby until her mid-30s. She protested that she had told Joseph before they got married that she wasn't interested in starting a family until much later. I was very clear about it in my own head, and I told him over and over again. But he didn't listen to me. I should have worn a T-shirt with big block letters, "I'm not ready to have children." Joseph acknowledged that Amira had indeed made her position clear to him, but he had convinced himself that she didn't mean what she said. I was sure that she was only kidding herself. How could acting a bit part on a soap opera be more important than being a mother? Satisfying his urgent need to have children was so important to him that he had discounted his wife's priorities. We all have a number of these subterranean hotspots in our relationships, places where our expectations of our partners collide with reality. When our partners behave in ways that deviate from our idealized view of them, we have an arsenal of weapons to help us maintain our illusions. We can condemn them. You are a bad, ungrateful, insensitive, boorish, stupid, spiteful, uninformed, crass, unenlightened, etc. person for feeling that way. We can educate them. You don't really feel that way. What you really feel is, we can threaten them. Unless you change your mind, I'm going to. We can ignore them. Very interesting. As I was saying, or we can analyze them. The reason you have such unacceptable thoughts and feelings is that years ago, your mother... In all of these responses, what we are trying to do is diminish our partner's sense of self and replace it with our own self-serving illusion. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened to our partners in childhood. In dozens of ways, their caretakers told them, only some of your feelings are valid. Only a portion of your behaviors are permitted. Instead of helping our partners repair this emotional damage, we add further injury. The Imago Dialogue. To move beyond this tragic state of affairs, we have to learn a new way of talking, which, as you will soon see, is also a new way of knowing. Working with Helen and my Imago colleagues, I gradually developed an exercise called the Imago Dialogue. Imago Dialogue involves 3 different steps: mirroring, validation, and empathy. The Imago Dialogue plays a number of roles in the creation of a conscious partnership. First of all, it focuses your attention on the actual words your partner is saying. If you're like most people, you do not pay full attention when your partner is talking. When you should be listening, you are instead responding to the impact of what you are hearing. My partner just said that he wants a separate vacation. What does that mean? Does he want to spend less time around me? Is he going to meet someone else? In a sense, you are listening to yourself react. When you focus on your inner reaction, instead of on the words your partner is saying, your partner senses that disconnect. Second, when you listen carefully and then ask your partner what those words mean to him or her, you discover that you do indeed live with another person, someone whose inner experience is quite different from yours. This awareness is called differentiation, and it is a necessary precondition for a safe, intimate relationship. While there are many similarities in nature, leaves on the same tree, for example, are very similar to each other. No 2 leaves on one tree are identical. Difference is a fact of nature. When you honor the differences between you and another, you begin to move from making your partner into an object towards seeing them as a person. When you assume that your partner is identical to you, you turn him or her into you, which effectively negates their existence. In a healthy relationship, you realize that you live with another person who is not an extension of you. Failure to recognize one another's separate existence is the major source of conflict between partners. Finally, the regular use of the Imago Dialogue creates a deep emotional connection between you and your partner. This is especially true when you are in conflict. Using this structured way of talking creates emotional safety, which is necessary for a lasting connection. When you feel safe, your defenses relax. You become aware of parts of yourself that have been hidden from view since childhood, and you sense enough trust in the relationship to express them. I really am musical. I am basically a peaceful person. When you put these experiences into words, they are rewoven into the fabric of your being, and you experience becoming whole. Ultimately, this experience extends beyond your personal boundaries and helps restore your connection to the universe. When talking together reaches this profound level, it becomes a spiritual experience. When you connect at the local level of a personal relationship, you connect at the cosmic level with the transcendent. The 3 steps of the Imago Dialogue. Let's take a closer look at the 3 steps of the Imago Dialogue. The first is called mirroring. When one of you has something important to say, you begin by stating that thought or feeling in a short sentence beginning with I. For example, I don't enjoy cooking dinner for you when you don't seem to appreciate all the effort involved. Your partner restates the sentence in his or her own words and then asks if the message was received correctly. Let me see if I got it. You find it hard to put the effort into cooking dinner every night when I don't show my appreciation for all that you've done. Did I get you? You repeat this process until your partner clearly understands what you mean to say. Mirroring, like many of the tools we use in Imago relationship therapy, had its origin in my relationship with Helen. One day before we were married, Helen and I were engaged in an intense discussion. Although we were not angry, we were determined to get our points across. Suddenly, Helen paused the conversation and said, "Stop. We're not listening to each other. I have an idea. Why don't we take turns talking and listening? You can talk while I listen. Then I'll say back to you what I heard. Then we can switch. I'll talk and you listen." I agreed, and we ended up having a very good conversation. In fact, we felt unusually close to each other. I was not a stranger to the value of listening. As a therapist, I make it a practice to listen carefully to all of my clients. I also encouraged couples to listen closely to one another, but I had always viewed mirroring as a way to help them understand each other's words and solve specific problems. Until that experience with Helen, I hadn't realized that mirroring has a deeper healing effect. It can strengthen the feelings of connection between couples, giving it a value in and of itself. After a few years, I added another step to the mirroring portion of the exercise. Once the receiving partner had understood what the sending partner had said, I coached the receiver to add these words: "Is there more?" This gave the sender a chance to expand on the topic. "It takes me at least an hour to cook dinner, and I do my best to make it attractive and delicious. I feel sad when you eat without comment." The sender continues adding more information until he or she has no more to say. In my ongoing work with couples, I have found that this "tell me more" part of the mirroring exercise is one of the keys to its success. When you ask your partner to continue talking, it sends the message that you care about your partner's inner experience. This deepens the sense of connection between you. You benefit in another way as well, because you gain enough additional information about your partner that you can more fully comprehend his or her point of view. Meanwhile, your partner discovers that being encouraged to keep on talking can bring up thoughts and feelings that he or she hasn't been able to put into words before. Saying them out loud at long last helps your partner integrate them into his or her sense of self and become more whole. Although mirroring is a relatively straightforward process, it is very different from the way that couples normally talk to each other, a phenomenon which might be called a parallel monologue. Breaking the old habits can require a great deal of practice. Here's an example of the common problems that people have with mirroring. It's also a good example of a parallel monologue. The conversation took place at an Imago workshop when I asked a couple to volunteer to come to the front of the group and talk about a sensitive issue, just as they would at home. Greg and Sheila, a young couple who had been living together for only a few months, volunteered. Greg started the conversation. Greg: "Sheila, I'm really bothered by your smoking, and I'd like you to be more considerate when you smoke around me." Because I had yet to introduce Sheila and Greg to the mirroring exercise, Sheila followed her natural instincts and responded with an automatic defense. Sheila: "You knew that I smoked when you asked me to live with you. You accepted that fact in the beginning. Why are you always so critical of me? You should accept me as I am. You know that I'm trying to cut down." Greg, operating on automatic pilot, returned her remarks with an intensified criticism. The conversation was turning into a tennis match. Greg, I acknowledge your efforts to smoke less, but I find it interesting that when we come here and the sign in the dining room says no smoking, you follow it. Yet I feel invaded at home with the smell of tobacco smoke all over the place. Sheila, well, this is not my home, and I feel I have a right to smoke in my own home. Sheila delivered this last message with some force, and there was a smattering of applause from the crowd. The score was love 15. It was time for me to referee. Hendricks. Okay, let's start this all over again and see if we can turn it into an exercise in communication, not confrontation. Greg, would you repeat your opening statement? Greg. I'm really glad that we're making a home together. But with regard to your smoking, when we joined together, I didn't realize how difficult it was going to be for me. Hendricks. Okay. Now I would like you to simplify that statement so it will be easier to understand. Greg. Let's see. Your smoking bothers me. I didn't think it would at first, but it does. Hendricks. Good. Now, Sheila, I want you to paraphrase Greg, trying to mirror his feelings and thoughts without criticizing him or defending yourself. Then I want you to ask Greg if you have heard him correctly. Sheila. I'm truly sorry that my smoking interferes. Hendricks. No, I'm not asking you to apologize. Just reflect back to Greg what he was saying and show your understanding and acceptance of his feelings. Sheila. Could he possibly repeat himself? Greg. Your smoking bothers me. I didn't think it would at first, but it does. Hendricks. Now try to feed that back to him with receptive warmth. Sheila. I think I'd rather stop smoking. Group laughter. Hendricks. Take a deep breath and be aware that he is experiencing some discomfort at one of your behaviors. Rather than hearing it as a criticism of your behavior, hear it with concern for his well-being. Whether it's justified or not, he is feeling uncomfortable, and you care about him. I know this is hard to do in front of a lot of people, and I know that this is an issue you feel strongly about. Sheila. What could be done? Hendricks. No, don't try to solve it. You just want to paraphrase his message and the emotional content behind it, so that he knows that you understand what he is feeling. Sheila. Takes a deep breath. Okay, I think I get it now. I understand that it really bothers you that I smoke. You didn't realize how much it would bother you until we actually started living together. Now you are very troubled by it. Is that what you're saying? Hendricks. Excellent. I could hear Greg's concern reflected in your voice. Did that check out with you, Greg? Is she hearing what you have to say? Greg. Yes, that's just how I feel. What a relief. This is the first time she's ever really bothered to listen to me. As Greg's reaction shows, there is a tremendous satisfaction in simply being heard, in knowing that your message has been received exactly as you sent it. This is a rare phenomenon in most relationships. After demonstrating this exercise for workshop groups, I send the couples back to their rooms so they can practice sending and receiving simple statements. Invariably, they return to the group reporting that it was a novel, exhilarating experience. It is such an unexpected luxury to have your partner's full attention. Validation. Once couples have become adept at mirroring each other, I encourage them to go on to the next step of the Imago dialogue, validation. In this part of the exercise, they learn how to affirm the internal logic of each other's remarks. In essence, they are telling each other, "What you're saying makes sense to me. I can see how you are thinking and why you would think that way." I had my first and most indelible experience with the power of validation when I was a young man. It was 1960, and I'd been sent to Louisville, Kentucky to be a chaplain in a mental hospital where I was assigned to a ward for schizophrenic patients. I was given very little training in the beginning. Basically, I was told, go in there and relate the best you can. As time went on, I would be given more supervision. But in the first few weeks, it was sink or swim. One of the first patients I tried to get to know was a gaunt man in his 50s, whom I will call Leonard. One thing I remember about Leonard is that he was a non-stop smoker. I always saw him through a veil of smoke. But the reason he has stayed in my mind all these years is that he was convinced he was Jesus. "Hello, Leonard," I said to him when we were first introduced. "My name is Harville." "I'm Jesus," he replied calmly, drawing on his cigarette. "Not Leonard." I was taken aback, but I covered up my reaction. "Oh," I said, "I'm a theological student, so I have a different concept of Jesus, but I'm pleased to meet you." As the days went on, I found myself drawn to Leonard, primarily because I was so fascinated by his unshakable conviction that he was Jesus. I didn't try to convince him otherwise, because I could see that that would have been pointless. I just studied his internal logic. Eventually, Leonard began to feel safe enough with me that he started to share some of the voices inside his head. When I found out exactly what the voices were saying to him, and that those voices were as real to him as the words coming out of my mouth, Leonard's view of himself as Jesus began to make complete sense to me. I hasten to add that I didn't think he was Jesus, but I could see why he thought that he was. It made all the sense in his world. The day came when I decided to address Leonard as Jesus. This didn't seem blasphemous to me. Indeed, it seemed a form of respect. Why add yet more conflict to his life when his head was already a battleground? If he thought he was Jesus, I was going to go along with it. I walked up to him that morning and said, "Hello, Jesus." To my surprise, he said, "I'm not Jesus. I'm Leonard." I sputtered for a moment and said, "But you've been telling me for weeks that you're Jesus." "Yes," he said, "but my voices are now telling me that I don't have to be Jesus with you." Validation had moved him one step closer to sanity. Adding validation to mirroring. When I first worked with couples, the communication exercise stopped with mirroring. I didn't require them to go on and validate the internal logic of each other's messages. As I gained more experience, I began to see that validation is a vital step in the process. I remember the first time I asked a couple to add validation to mirroring. The two people, I'll call them Rita and Doug, were in their 40s. Rita was a school teacher, and I think Doug was an insurance salesman. Their central problem was their inability to connect emotionally. When Rita tried to talk with her husband about something important, Doug would answer half-heartedly and then emotionally withdraw. Over time, I learned that one reason he withdrew was that he often felt critical of her, and he was trying to keep from being her constant critic. In his own way, he was trying to improve the relationship. But understandably, his unwillingness to respond to Rita infuriated her. to get the sense of connection she was longing for. She would raise her voice and exaggerate her statements until he would finally respond. As I write this, I can almost see Doug react to one of Rita's outbursts. He would start breathing very shallowly. His face would flush. Then he would cross his arms and lean his body away from her. If Rita persisted long enough, Doug would finally react. Unfortunately, his response, once it came, was cold and accusatory, and served only to throw gasoline on her fire. To help them break out of this destructive pattern, I taught them the mirroring exercise. It helped a great deal because Rita had to slow down her torrent of words, and Doug had to stay in contact. But the exercise did not produce the kind of results I was used to seeing. Their communication improved dramatically, but there was little enhanced sense of connection. At a loss, I remember turning to Rita one day and asking her, "What do you want from Doug that you're not getting?" Her response was immediate. "I want him to tell me that I make sense, that I'm not crazy." A light went on in my head. Rita wanted more than to be heard. She wanted her thought processes to be validated. She wanted her husband to tell her that her worldview made sense. I turned to Doug and asked him if he would be willing to add another step to the mirroring exercise. As soon as he had paraphrased Rita correctly, would he tell her that what she was saying made sense to him? Doug thought for a long moment and then said, "But what if she doesn't make sense to me?" I told him that he didn't have to agree with Rita or give up his own point of view in order to validate hers. He just needed to suspend his view of the world for a moment and make an honest effort to see hers. Doug thought it over and said he would try. Rita made a statement. I no longer remember what it was, and Doug paraphrased it back to her. Instead of waiting for me to structure the next part of the exercise, however, Rita blurted out, "Well, do you agree, Doug?" For once, Doug was equally quick on the draw. "No," he said belligerently, "I do not agree." Rita persisted. "But do I make sense to you? Does what I say make sense? Do you think I'm crazy?" "No, I don't think you're crazy," Doug said, "but I certainly don't agree with you." Rita got out of her chair and grabbed Doug's forearms. "So, what I say makes sense to you?" "Yes," Doug acknowledged. "When I see it from your point of view, yes, you do make sense. I just see things differently." I'll never forget how Rita responded. She sank to her knees in front of Doug and began crying. "That's all that I wanted to hear," she said. "I haven't heard that before, from you or from anybody. I'm not crazy. I make sense." Finally, someone was affirming her truth. Even today, I am impressed by how aggressively each of us defends our separate reality. It must be connected to our fear of the loss of self. If I see it your way, I will have to surrender my way. If I feel your experience, I will have to invalidate mine. If what I say is true, then what you say must be false. There can be only one center of the universe, and that center has got to be me. But if I muster the courage to suspend my own view of the universe for a moment, and manage to see a fraction of your reality, something miraculous happens. First of all, you feel safer around me. Because I am no longer challenging your worldview, you can start to lower your defenses. As you do this, you become more willing to acknowledge a portion of my reality. Because I have abandoned my centrist position, you are more willing to let go of yours. To our mutual surprise, a drawbridge begins to descend on its rusty hinges, and you and I connect. Empathy. The third step in Imago dialogue is empathy. It makes sense that empathy would follow on the heels of validation. If you listen carefully to your partner, understand the totality of what he or she is saying, and then affirm the logic behind your partner's words, you are ready to acknowledge and respond to the feelings behind those thoughts. Your first task is to try to imagine what those feelings might be. If your partner's feelings are conveyed beyond his or her words, by facial expression or tone of voice, you will have little trouble intuiting them. If your partner's feelings are not so obvious, you will have to imagine what they might be. In either case, you need to check with your partner to see if you perceive their feelings accurately. Given the fact that you said I neglected you, I'm wondering if you feel hurt by my neglect. Is that how you feel? Checking to confirm the accuracy respects your partner's reality and enhances your emotional presence, an essential ingredient of healing. Asking for confirmation also deepens your partner's experience of empathy. He will think, my partner is being very respectful of my feelings. She cares how I really feel. For some people, validation of their thought processes is more important to them than validation of their feelings. But for others, empathy is the key to their healing. Once someone affirms their raw emotions, they begin to feel loved and whole. I hate to say it because it perpetuates our gender stereotypes, but in my experience, women tend to value empathy more than men, at least at first. If you stop and think about it, this makes sense. In our culture, indeed in most cultures, women are allowed to express their feelings more freely than men. Although this is beginning to change, many men still believe it is unmanly to disclose their emotions, especially their tender feelings or feelings of fear and weakness. So if we men feel uncomfortable showing our feelings to others in the first place, you can hardly expect us to want our partners to empathize with us should we happen to let a feeling slip out. We'd just as soon that they overlook the momentary lapse and focus on our steely logic instead. Many women, on the other hand, have had the opposite experience. The culture has allowed them to keep more of their emotional wholeness, but they've had to live with men who are relatively devoid of feeling. Their partners not only fail to empathize with them, they just as soon ignore the fact that their female partners have feelings altogether. Why can't you be more rational? When couples master the three-step process of mirroring, validation, and empathy, these gender differences begin to diminish. A man who is emotionally repressed starts to value empathy as much as his female partner. The reason this occurs is that seeing and acknowledging his partner's feelings makes him more comfortable with his own. Meanwhile, a woman who is emotionally volatile can become less so, because she no longer needs to amplify her feelings in order to have her stoic partner acknowledge them. She can express them with less force. This is especially true for anger. It is always surprising to me to see how quickly anger will dissipate once it's been received and fully acknowledged. As you might imagine, the ease with which you can empathize with your partner depends a great deal on the situation. It's very easy to be sympathetic when the two of you share the same experience and react similarly to that event. Let's suppose you and I have just been through a major earthquake. We survived the quake without any injuries, and we are relieved to see that the house still stands on its foundation. But there were several frightening minutes when we both thought we were going to die. I was so terrified, your partner exclaims. You respond immediately, I can see that you were. I was too. Because you've had the same response to the same situation, there is no stretching involved. What you feel, I feel. We had the same reaction. Empathy is a more challenging response. It is the ability to understand what another person is experiencing, even though you have not had that identical experience. Let's assume that your partner was in the earthquake, but you were gone on business, 500 miles away. Your partner reaches you on the phone, describes the horrific event, and then cries out to you, "I was so terrified." Although you didn't experience the earthquake yourself, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that you might have been terrified as well. "I can imagine you were," you reply with only a moment's hesitation. Problems tend to arise when two people react quite differently to similar events. For example, your partner might be terrified of flying, but you can fall asleep during takeoff or landing. You're going to have a harder time empathizing with your partner's fear because you've never experienced it in this situation. Just breathe deeply, you tell your partner. Think about something else, and the feelings will go away. And quite frankly, you wish they would disappear. They seem so irrational. You want to deflect your partner's feelings, not empathize with them. The most difficult situation of all, however, may be those times when your partner has strong, negative emotions, and you, poor soul, seem to have triggered them. "I am so angry at you that you told Janice she could go to the movies when you know I already told her she has to stay home and clean her room. You always do this." Or, "I felt so humiliated when I saw you flirting with Paul in front of all of our friends. You know how jealous that makes me." Your instinctual response is to defend yourself and then counterattack. Being empathetic is the farthest thing from your mind. To do so requires tremendous discipline, practice, and emotional maturity. Sender responsibility. When I first developed the Imago Dialogue and began to teach it to couples, I did not focus much on the responsibilities of the person sending the message. I thought that the sender should have full license to express their thoughts and feelings without inhibition, and I encouraged the receiver to mirror back whatever they heard without reacting. Over time, as I trained more Imago therapists and workshop presenters, I learned that most of their couples found it difficult not to overreact. My colleagues began experimenting with coaching the sender as well as the receiver. They developed a concept called sender responsibility. This meant that the person sending the message had to follow certain rules that were designed to make the message easier for the receiver to hear. The first rule was to use I language when expressing a frustration. Instead of blurting out, "You made me feel so ashamed when you treated our neighbor that way," you say, "I felt ashamed when you treated our neighbor that way." The second rule is that you should avoid making critical remarks about your partner's character and focus instead on your partner's behavior. Instead of saying, "You are always late, you have no sense of responsibility," you say, "When you are late, I feel frustrated and scared." In addition, you moderate the intensity of your emotions so that your partner feels safe enough to relax and listen. After all, your goal is not to wound your partner, but to deepen the connection between you. We learned that being a responsible sender is just as important as being a good listener. When you manage both ends of the transaction so that you can talk to each other without rupturing your sense of connection, you will have mastered one of the most effective tools for creating a safe and lasting union. But isn't dialoguing with your partner tedious? As helpful as the Imago Dialogue may be, people have an almost universal reaction to it. Do we really have to go through all those steps in order to communicate something meaningful? The answer to this specific question is no. If all you're seeking is effective communication, then mirroring alone may be sufficient. But if you want to move beyond communication to communion, then you need to include all three steps. That said, I don't want to diminish how time-consuming and artificial the Imago dialogue can seem. There are times when you will rebel at the structure and want to revert to old habits. I am reminded of a 17-year-old son of a friend of mine who is a superb baseball player. He is so good, in fact, that he's been singled out by a ball club for special instruction, even before leaving high school. To the boy's dismay, however, his new coach wants him to change virtually everything about the way that he pitches and hits the ball. He's been given a series of exercises to help him build up certain muscles and stretch out others. And he is required to hit 100 balls a day using an alien-feeling stance and grip. At times, he has been close to tears because he feels as though he's had to abandon everything he knows about baseball. So it is with the Imago dialogue. It requires you to abandon some deeply ingrained habits and adopt a formulaic way of relating. Much of the time, it's going to feel forced. But as you begin to experience some of its benefits, you will become less resistant. Eventually, and it may take years, you will have transformed your relationship to the point that you will be able to abandon the exercise altogether. When that day arrives, you will be communing, not just conversing. The Imago Workup. Once couples have been taught the Imago dialogue, I introduce them to an information gathering tool called the Imago Workup. This is a guided imagery technique that helps each partner become better acquainted with their own childhood wounds. When the exercise is completed, I have them share their observations using the Imago dialogue. This is an effective way for couples to begin to see each other as they really are, as wounded beings on a quest for spiritual wholeness. Before the exercise begins, I ask the couples to close their eyes and relax. I often put on some soothing music to help them shut out distractions. When they are sufficiently relaxed, I ask them to try to remember their childhood home, the earliest one they can recall. When the vision begins to take shape, I tell them to see themselves as very young children wandering through the house, searching for their caretakers. The first person they meet is their mother, or whichever female caretaker was most influential in their early years. I tell them that they are suddenly endowed with magical powers and can see these women's positive and negative character traits with crystal clarity. They are to note these characteristics and then imagine themselves telling their mothers what they always wanted from them and never got. In a similar manner, I have them encounter their fathers or primary male caretakers, and then any other people who had a profound influence on them in their formative years. When they have gathered all the information they can about these key people, I slowly bring them back to reality and have them open their eyes and write the information down on a piece of paper. I am often surprised by how much information people can gain from this simple exercise. For example, a young man did the exercise and realized for the first time how lonely and isolated he felt as a child. He had blocked out this crucial piece of information because it hadn't made any sense to him. How could he feel lonely in a family with 4 children, a minister for a father, and a devoted homemaker for a mother? In his fantasy, however, he had searched and searched around the house for his father, never to find him. When he encountered his mother, his spontaneous question to her was, "Why are you always so busy? Can't you see that I need you?" Having these insights helped him understand his chronic depression. Until this moment, he said, My sadness has always been a mystery to me. Once people have completed the guided imagery exercise, they have the information they need to construct their imagos, the inner images of the opposite sex that guided them in mate selection. All they need to do is group together the positive and negative traits of all the key people from their childhood, highlighting the traits that affected them the most. These are the traits that they were looking for in a mate. When this work is completed, I ask couples to share what they have learned. I ask them to listen to each other with full attention, making no effort to interpret each other's remarks, enlarge upon them, compare them with their own, or analyze them. The only allowable comments are mirroring comments that indicate the degree of their understanding. By doing this exercise, husbands and wives begin to see behind each other's neurotic, puzzling, or compulsive behavior to the wounds they are trying to heal. This creates a more compassionate, supportive, emotional climate. The parent-child dialogue. In the years since the original version of this book was written, a number of other Imago Workshop presenters have contributed to the workshop and to Imago therapy. Maya Coleman, a master trainer, suggested a new exercise called the parent-child dialogue. In this exercise, which in our workshops occurs after the exercise called the Imago Workup, couples deepen their awareness of their childhood wounds and increase their empathy for each other. Sitting face to face, one partner takes on the role of the caretaker, and the other partner imagines him or herself as a small child and talks to the caretaker from a child's point of view. The person playing the caretaker asks a series of questions, beginning with, "Tell me what it was like living with me." The child responds. After mirroring the child with empathy, the caregiver then asks, "What was the worst thing for you about all that?" Once again, the child talks about what was most difficult. Mirroring the child's response with warmth and empathy, the caregiver now asks, "What do you need from me that would heal all that?" Typically, the child says something like, "I need you to be there for me and listen when I talk." The partner who is playing the caregiver role closes the exercise by saying, "I want you to have all of that, whenever you need it. Thanks for telling me about your pain and what you need from me." Then they switch roles and repeat the exercise. This exercise is powerful for both partners. The partner playing the role of the child recalls their childhood wounds more deeply than in other exercises. The partner in the caregiving role gains a greater understanding of the other partner's early vulnerability. The most exciting thing about this particular exercise is that the empathic response of the listening partner is so different from the type of wounding response one might have gotten from one's actual caretaker that it begins to heal the partner's wound. If the real-life caregiver had responded this way in the past, the wound would not have occurred in the first place. What fascinates me most about the parent-child dialogue is that when the partner who has regressed into childhood memories talks about his or her pain from the past, the listening partner often recognizes that he or she has frustrated the speaking partner in similar ways, unwittingly reopening childhood wounds. However, the structure of the exercise prevents any reaction. Then, in the closing statement, when the regressed child says what he or she needs from the parent, the listening partner gains new insight into what needs to be done to help his or her partner heal. The parent-child dialogue is an indirect way of learning how to be each other's healers. Chapter 10. Defining Your Curriculum. From Lewis Carroll. One of the deep secrets of life is that all that is really worth doing is what we do for others. So far in this book, I've described the initial steps in the creation of a conscious partnership. I've talked about making a commitment to narrow your exits so that more of your energy is available for your relationship. I've talked about increasing the pleasurable interactions between you to set the stage for greater intimacy. And I've discussed several ways to increase your knowledge of yourself and your partner. Now is the time to talk about the healing of deeper childhood wounds. In this chapter, I will describe a way you can turn your chronic frustrations into avenues for growth. In the next chapter, I will talk about ways to remove the underlying cause of most explosive conflicts. When a couple have spent several weeks practicing the re-romanticizing exercise described in Chapter 8, they experience a revival of positive feelings, and they begin to bond with each other much the way they did during the early stages of romantic love. Just as they grow accustomed to this more intimate, nurturing environment, however, a disheartening event occurs. Conflicts begin to emerge, the very ones that brought them into therapy in the first place. Once again, they are plagued with the same troublesome issues, the same basic incompatibilities. It seems as though the re-romanticizing exercise has resurrected romantic love, only to let it disintegrate once again into a power struggle. The reason the good feelings don't last is that through increased pleasurable interactions, the husband and wife have unconsciously identified each other once again as the one who has it all, the ideal mate who is magically going to restore their wholeness. After the anger and withdrawal of the power struggle, they are once again turning to each other for salvation. And once again, they make the unpleasant discovery that neither of them has the necessary skills or the motivation to meet the other's deeper needs. In fact, on their own, many people make the same sobering discovery I made in my first marriage. What they want most from their partners are least able to give. What can be done to resolve this central dilemma? The question bedeviled me in my early years as a marital therapist. Given these two facts, one, that we enter our love relationships bearing emotional scars from childhood, and two, that we unwittingly choose mates who resemble our caretakers, the very people who contributed to our wounding in the first place, it seems that intimate love relationships are destined to repeat, not repair, our early misfortunes. Years ago, when I lectured to groups, this pessimistic view came through loud and clear. During one talk, I was explaining the self-defeating nature of mate selection, and a woman raised her hand to say, "Dr. Hendricks, maybe the way to avoid re-injuring old wounds is to marry people you don't feel attracted to. That way you won't wind up with people who have the same faults as your parents." Everyone laughed, but at the time I could offer no better solution. Relationships arranged by conscious choice, by go-betweens, or by computerized dating services appeared to have a better chance of succeeding than relationships based on an unconscious selection process. Our tendency to select partners who share the positive and negative traits of our caretakers seemed to doom conventional love relationships from the start. My only advice to couples was to become more aware of their hidden reasons for marrying each other and to embrace the cold, hard facts of reality. Awareness, insight, understanding, and acceptance. That was the only solace I had to offer. At the time, I was getting the same counsel from my own therapist. You have to accept the fact that your mother didn't have any energy for you, Harville, he would tell me. And your wife can't give you what you want either. She can't make up for those early years. You just have to let go of those longings. In other words, you didn't get it then, and you're not going to get it now. Grow up and get on with life. I tried to accept what he was telling me, but I was aware that in the core of my being, I was unwilling to let go of my unfinished business. A part of me felt that I had an inalienable right to a secure and loving upbringing. As I scrutinized my clients, I could see that they were clinging just as tenaciously to their needs. They might repress them, they might deny them, they might project them onto others. But they couldn't let go of their childhood needs once and for all. There had to be a different and better way. So I continued looking. Why self-love doesn't work. Eventually, I sought out a different therapist, one with a more optimistic view about the possibility of resolving childhood needs. He believed that it was possible for people to make up for what they didn't get in childhood through self-love. One of his techniques to help me overcome my craving for nurturing was to have me imagine the scene in the kitchen with my mother that I talked about earlier. He would guide me through a deep relaxation exercise, then say to me, "Harville, imagine yourself as a little baby wanting your mother's attention. She is standing at the stove with her back to you. Imagine how you want to be hugged. Call out to her. See her come over to you and pick you up with a big smile on her face. She is now holding you close. Put your arms across your chest. See that little boy. He's right there in front of you and wants to be hugged. Hold him and hug him and fill him with love. Now, pull the little boy into your chest. Pull that happy little boy inside of you." It was his belief that if I succeeded in creating a vivid picture of myself being loved by my mother, I would gradually fill up my need for maternal love. His approach seemed to work for a while. After each session, I would feel less alone, more loved. But the feeling gradually disappeared, and I would once again be filled with emptiness. The reason this approach doesn't work is that it is sabotaged by the old brain. When we were infants, unable to meet our physical and emotional needs, pain and pleasure came magically from the outside world. When the bottle or the breast appeared, our hunger was satisfied. When we were cuddled, we felt soothed. When we were left alone in our cribs to cry, we felt angry and afraid. As we grew older, our old brain remained frozen in this passive worldview. Good feelings and bad feelings were created by the actions of other people. We couldn't take care of ourselves. Others had to do it for us. The part of me that hurt couldn't accept love from within myself because I had no way to receive self-love. Nor does anyone else. Salvation is not an inside job. It is the outcome of being nourished by others. But at that time, I did not know this fundamental truth. The limits of friendship. I gradually resigned myself to the fact that healing love has to come from outside oneself. But did it have to come from an intimate partner? Couldn't it come from a close friend? At the time when I was musing over this possibility, I was leading several counseling groups and had an opportunity to observe the healing potential of friendships. Close bonds often develop between members of therapy groups, and I encourage this love and support. In a typical session, I might pair Mary, who grew up with a neurotic, unaffectionate mother, with Susan, a strong earth mother figure. I asked Susan to hold Mary on her lap and stroke her and let her cry. Mary would feel soothed by the exercise, but she wouldn't be healed. I enjoyed the hugging, she said, but Susan's not the right person. It's not Susan I need hugs from, it's someone else. After numerous experiments like this, I concluded that the love we are seeking has to come not just from another person within the context of a safe, intimate relationship, but from an imago match. Someone so similar to our parents that our unconscious mind has them fused. This appears to be the only way to erase the pains of childhood. We may enjoy the hugs and attentions of other people, but the effects are transitory. It's like the difference between sugar and NutraSweet. Our taste buds may be deceived by the taste of artificial sweeteners, but our bodies derive no nourishment from them. In just such a way, we hunger for love from our original caretakers, or from people who are so similar to them that on an unconscious level, we have them merged. But this brought me back full circle to the original dilemma. How can our partners heal us if they have some of the same negative traits as our caretakers? Aren't they the least likely candidates to soothe our emotional injuries? If the daughter of a distant, self-absorbed father unconsciously selects a workaholic for a husband, how can her relationship satisfy her need for closeness and intimacy? If the son of a depressed, sexually repressed mother chooses to marry a depressed, frigid wife, how can he recapture his sensuality and joy? If a girl whose father died when she was young moves in with a man who refuses to marry her, how can she feel loved and secure? An answer began to take shape in my mind. It was the only logical conclusion. If people were going to be healed, I conjectured, their partners would have to change. The workaholic husband would have to willingly redirect some of his energy back to his wife. The depressed, frigid wife would have to recover her energy and sensuality. The reluctant lover would have to lower his barriers to intimacy. Then and only then would they be able to give their partners the consistent nurturing they had been looking for all their lives. It was at this point that I began to see the unconscious selection process in a new light. While it was often true that what one partner needed the most was what the other partner was least able to give, it also happened to be the precise area where that partner needed to grow. For example, if Mary grew up with caretakers who were sparing in their physical affection, she most likely has chosen a husband, George, who is uncomfortable with bodily contact. The unmet childhood need in Mary is invariably matched by George's inability to meet that need. But if George were to overcome his resistance to being affectionate in an effort to satisfy Mary's needs, not only would Mary get the physical reassurance she craved, but George would slowly regain contact with his own sensuality. In other words, in his efforts to heal his partner, he would be recovering an essential part of himself. The unconscious selection process has brought together two people who can either hurt each other or heal each other, depending upon their willingness to grow and change. Turning the theory into practice, I began to focus my attention on turning the healing potential of love relationships into a workable reality. The unanswered question was, how could people be encouraged to overcome their limitations so they could meet their partner's needs? Wouldn't most people be reluctant to change for their partner's sake alone? Wouldn't they want something for themselves? Of course they would. What could be more rewarding, I thought, than for them to be able to get back parts of themselves that had been repressed in childhood? I decided that this would become the bait that would encourage people to become a healing resource for their partners. I began to develop an exercise called the Behavior Change Request Dialogue that would help make this happen. It had some of the same features as the re-romanticizing exercise. One partner would be asked to come up with a list of requests, which the other partner would be free to honor or not. In this exercise, however, the requests would be for changes in behavior, not for simple, pleasurable interactions. In fact, virtually every one of the requests would zero in on a point of contention. For instance, people would be asking their partners to become more assertive, or more accepting, or less manipulative. In essence, they would be asking them to overcome their most prominent negative traits. As in the re-romanticizing exercise, these general requests would have to be converted into specific, measurable, time-limited activities. Otherwise, the partner wouldn't have enough information to be able to change, and there would be too much room for misinterpretation and evasive maneuvers. Also, like the re-romanticizing exercise, the behavior change request dialogue would have to rely on the principle of the gift, not the contract. Otherwise, the unconscious mind would reject the change in behaviors. This was very important. If one person made a small change and then waited for the partner to match his or her efforts, I'll work on becoming less domineering if you will work on becoming more nurturing, the whole process would quickly degenerate into a power struggle. The old animosities would flare up, and there would be no possibility of healing. People would have to learn how to overcome their limitations and develop their capacity to love, not because they expected love in return, but simply because their partners deserve to be loved. With the general framework of the new exercise in place, I began to fill in the details. How would people determine exactly what behaviors to request of their partners? Two individuals may be quick to complain and criticize each other, but they are rarely able to state in positive, specific terms exactly what they need from each other. How could they come up with this information when it was not readily available to their consciousness? Wouldn't it take months or even years of intensive therapy? There was an easier solution, I realized, and that was for them to examine their criticisms of their partners. As I explained in the previous chapter, couples can get an accurate picture of what they did not get in childhood by analyzing their chronic complaints about their partners. The details aren't there, who did what when, but the raw material is sitting right on the surface, ready to be mined. The months or years that the couple have spent together have worn away their softer, more superficial annoyances and exposed the stony outcrop of their fundamental needs. You never, you always. When are you ever going to? At the heart of these accusations is a disguised plea for the very things they didn't get in childhood: affection, affirmation, protection, independence, attachment. To come up with a list of requests for this exercise, therefore, the couples would simply need to isolate the desires hidden in their chronic frustrations. They needed to let go of the frustration and go straight to the wish embedded within. Then they could convert these general desires into specific behaviors that would help satisfy their needs. Other imago therapists have labeled these SMART requests: small, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-limited. This list of positive, specific requests would become the ongoing curriculum of the couple's relationship.